Bang! The lock on my barn door shattered, sending jagged pieces of metal flying through the air. The sharp crack of breaking steel rang out across the valley like a rifle shot. Almost instantly, Karen Whitfield's cold, victorious laugh pierced the silence as she stormed through the opening. She still clutched a crowbar, its end slick with dried paint, wielding it like a badge of authority. "I knew you were hiding something in here. This is an official community safety check," she bellowed, her voice thick with smug self-righteousness that made my stomach churn. Outside, the red and blue strobes of police vehicles danced across the barn walls, casting warped shadows across Karen's flushed face. She stood there beaming, as if she'd just cracked open a major criminal case. "There's no running from justice now, you code-breaking menace," she shouted, each word landing like a personal insult carved into stone. But what Karen didn't realize, or what she could never have predicted, was that by smashing that lock and barging onto my property, she hadn't just triggered my brand new security system. No. She'd also accidentally exposed the very thing she'd spent her life desperately trying to keep hidden. Welcome to Harper Stories, folks. Buckle up. It had started like any other quiet Tuesday. I was in the barn, elbow deep in restoring a stunning antique chair for Mrs. Patterson, one of my most loyal clients. It was a 1920s mahogany masterpiece, complete with ornate carvings that needed a steady, trained hand, something I'd inherited from my grandfather, along with this land and the skills I used every day. Name's Mason Brooks, 35, single, and perfectly content living a simple, peaceful life as a craftsman in the home my grandparents left me. I wasn't the chattiest neighbor in Willowbrook Heights, and sure, I kept a low profile, but I paid my dues, didn't cause trouble, and put my energy into making heirloom furniture that meant something to people. That barn had been my sanctuary since I returned 3 years ago to care for the family property. In there, surrounded by the scent of fresh stain and the soft rasp of sandpaper, I could tune out the noise of the modern world. It was therapy, meditation, my escape from people like Karen Whitfield. But apparently, choosing to live quietly and mind your own business was enough to rouse suspicion in the mind of our self-anointed community enforcer. Karen had been the president of the Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association for the past 2 years, ever since she and her husband, a lawyer named David, moved in. From the moment she arrived, she took it upon herself to mold our tranquil neighborhood into some twisted version of a suburban utopia, complete with arbitrary rules and military-grade enforcement. She was the kind of person who measured lawn height with a ruler and held emergency meetings over mailbox colors. She seemed to know exactly who left their porch lights on too late or which driveway had an oil spot. At 48, she had the sharp, hawkish features of someone always searching for something to criticize, and she dressed like she was en route to a corporate boardroom even when walking her tiny, barking dog around the block. Her voice had a screechy, glass-cutting pitch, especially when she slipped into her so-called community leadership mode, which was basically all the time. I tried to stay off her radar, kept my place tidy, skipped the HOA socials, and didn't get involved. But somehow, I knew my presence irritated her. Like I was a smudge on her perfect vision of neighborhood order that no amount of scrubbing could erase. That day, the slamming of car doors snapped me out of my calm. I heard footsteps, a heavy, deliberate uneasy crunching across the gravel outside. At first, I figured maybe there'd been a crash on the main road, or someone nearby had called in a burglary. But then I caught Karen's unmistakable voice rising above the static of police radios. Peering through the barn's small window, I spotted her gesturing wildly at 2 uniformed officers, theatrically pointing toward my barn like it was a ticking bomb. Sheriff Rodriguez is someone I chatted with a few times at the hardware store. It looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. His young partner, meanwhile, glanced around nervously like he expected a gunfight to break out at any second. The whole scene reeked of awkward obligation, like these cops had been roped into something ridiculous but couldn't just walk away from it. Karen, on the other hand, looked ready to burst with glee, practically bouncing on her heels like a kid about to open the biggest present under the tree. "Officers, I received a tip through our neighborhood watch app that Mr. Brooks is storing dangerous materials in violation of county code," Karen announced, her tone thick with authority, probably something she practiced in front of her bathroom mirror every morning. She brandished a piece of paper from her oversized bag and waved it in the air like it was a court order. As the elected head of the Willowbrook Heights HOA, I have the power to perform safety inspections on behalf of the community. I demand access now to confirm compliance with local storage laws. The way she said it, you'd think she was deputized by the governor himself, and for a second, even I started to wonder if she actually believed her own nonsense. But I'd never heard of any HOA president being granted such authority, official-looking paperwork or not. Sheriff Rodriguez took the document from her with the caution of someone who's seen one too many petty disputes blown out of proportion. His eyes scanned the page with the cool skepticism of a man who'd dealt with plenty of nonsense in his time. Meanwhile, Karen stood tall, chest puffed out, practically glowing with the pride of someone who thought she'd finally caught the neighborhood's biggest menace red-handed. But as I stood in that barn, surrounded by the scent of sawdust and the legacy of generations past, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very off. Karen knew far too much about my schedule, about where I worked, and even what I stored inside. And that wasn't just coincidence. There was far too much detailed knowledge about what I kept out here for this to be some random tip from a well-meaning neighbor. Karen had been watching me, tracking my habits, studying my daily rhythms, and biding her time until she could spring whatever twisted plan she had in motion. The realization hit me like ice water to the spine. Despite the warm sunlight pouring through the barn windows, for weeks, I'd had the uneasy sense that I wasn't entirely alone on my land. I'd catch the faintest motion out of the corner of my eye or notice footprints where none should have been. I chalked it up to paranoia or at worst, stray animals wandering through. But seeing Karen standing in my doorway, gripping a crowbar in one hand and a bogus legal document in the other, I understood now that those instincts hadn't been wrong. They'd been warnings. When Karen smashed that lock, she didn't just destroy a piece of hardware as she crossed a threshold. Something fundamental shifted in that moment. She hadn't just broken into my workshop as she'd exposed a piece of herself in the process. Something obsessive, something unhinged. As she stood there, chest heaving with exertion, eyes scanning my workspace like a predator surveying a fresh kill, it became painfully clear this wasn't about neighborhood safety or some HOA regulation. This was personal. It was about control, about power, and it was likely crossing legal lines in multiple directions. But for the first time during this whole debacle, I felt a flicker of optimism. Karen might have just pushed things too far. The way Sheriff Rodriguez was scrutinizing that document, his brow tightening with each second, it told me he was starting to see it too. Then something small and metallic slipped from Karen's coat pocket and clinked onto the barn floor. It landed next to a folded piece of paper that fluttered to a stop beside it. The sheriff bent down slowly, eyes narrowing as he retrieved them both. The object was an old brass key worn with age and attached to a plain ring that didn't match anything I owned. But it was the folded paper that chilled me to the bone. Sheriff Rodriguez unfolded it carefully and held it up to the light. In neatly printed handwriting were the words, "Brooks Property, a Technic 1 acquisition." Beneath that was a rough sketch of my land, complete with boundaries, several strange annotations referencing resistance assessment and timeline acceleration. The moment Karen caught sight of it, all the color drained from her face. The confident red flush she'd worn minutes earlier gave way to a ghostly pallor. The silence that fell over the barn was thick and unnerving. You could have sliced it with the very crowbar still dangling from Karen's hand. And as the sheriff stood there, staring at the paper, you could almost see the wheels turning behind his eyes. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice low and measured, "you want to explain what this key opens a broken bar and why you're carrying a map of Mr. Brooks's property with these notes?" His tone was that practiced neutrality officers used when they were trying to stay calm while their brain lit up with alarm bells. Deputy Martinez had stepped closer now, peering over his shoulder, pen already scribbling quickly in a small black notebook. It was no longer a neighborhood complaint, it was officially an investigation. Karen was floundering, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping on dry land. She was clearly scrambling to invent an excuse that would make this all seem harmless. But the longer she stayed silent, the guiltier she looked. Her hands began to tremble. She kept casting anxious glances toward the barn entrance, like she was calculating her odds of making a clean getaway. And honestly, it was the first rational thought she'd had all afternoon. Gone was the swaggering authority she'd marched in with. In its place was pure panic at the dawning horror of someone realizing they'd just made a terrible, irreversible mistake. A broken bar and there were witnesses. "Yeah, I can explain," she stammered at last, her voice stripped of all earlier command. She sounded like a teenager caught sneaking out of the house. Then, in a desperate burst, she lunged toward the sheriff, reaching for the piece of paper. But Sheriff Rodriguez had been in this position before. He stepped back smoothly, keeping the paper out of her reach with an ease that suggested long experience dealing with panicked suspects. "That's evidence for our community safety inspection," Karen blurted. "Mesa broken bar. He's been keeping hazardous chemicals, running an unlicensed operation in a residential zone. He's putting people in danger." The words tumbled out faster now, each one more hysterical and bizarre than the last. I could see the sheriff and his deputy exchanging one of those quiet, meaningful glances that said, "Yeah, none of this is adding up." In her unraveling desperation, Karen was revealing everything I'd long suspected. This wasn't about community improvement, it was about her need to control everything around her. I was just the latest obstacle in her carefully manicured reality. Then a familiar voice rang out from the edge of the barn. "Officers, if I'm yeah, broken bar." We all turned to see Mrs. Chen approaching, a steady, slow, and with the air of someone who was about to tip the entire situation upside down. Elena Chen, our 70-year-old neighbor and former federal judge, was known for her quiet presence and laser-sharp observations. And she never went anywhere without her trusty digital camera. Today was no exception. She wore that particular expression I'd come to recognize, a focused, deliberate look that meant she'd seen something important and had the receipts to prove it. "Apologies for the interruption," she said with precise diction, the kind that could silence a courtroom. "But I believe I may have some relevant information concerning Mrs. Whitfield's recent nighttime activities around Mr. Brooks's property." Karen's eyes went wide with real fear, and judging by the way she stiffened in place, I had a strong hunch that whatever Mrs. Chen was about to reveal a broken bar, it was going to be a game changer. It was clear that whatever Mrs. Chen was about to reveal, it wouldn't be good news for our self-appointed HOA dictator. "What kind of information are we talking about, Mrs. Chen?" Sheriff Rodriguez asked, and I could hear the relief in his voice. He was grateful of finally someone who might cut through the madness with actual facts. Mrs. Chen gave a small, knowing smile, the kind that comes from being well prepared for exactly this type of situation. With calm, practiced movements, she scrolled through her digital camera like she'd done it 100 times before. "I've noticed some suspicious nighttime activity near Mr. Brooks's property over the last 2 weeks, she said, her voice as steady and professional as a court stenographer's. "Initially, I thought it might be burglars or trespassers, so I began documenting it for safety purposes." She paused, then turned the camera screen toward the officers. "But upon closer inspection, the person I caught sneaking around the property line with a flashlight and a measuring tape, that was Mrs. Whitfield." Even from a few feet away, I could clearly make out the photos of several shots of Karen creeping along my fence after dark, completely absorbed in whatever covert mission she thought she was on. Hardly the behavior of someone genuinely concerned about community safety. "Mrs. Whitfield," Sheriff Rodriguez began, his voice shifting from neighborly concern to formal law enforcement tone, "I'm going to need you to explain why you're in possession of a key to someone else's property, a set of detailed acquisition notes, and why you've been conducting unsanctioned surveillance at night." Karen's eyes darted from face to face, wild and searching alike. She was looking for a back door to reality itself. Then she opened her mouth to defend herself, and what came out wasn't clarity, it was desperation wrapped in delusion. "That key proves Mason stole from me," she shouted. "He must have duplicated it somehow. And now you're all helping him cover it up." She pointed at me like she was casting a spell, her voice rising into a near hysterical pitch. It was the kind of baseless accusation that would have been laughable if it weren't so jarring. But any hope she had of making that claim stick crumbled when the sheriff walked calmly over and tested the brass key, not on any of my locks, but on the gate to Karen's own property. It clicked open smoothly. The gate bore the familiar Whitfield Estate nameplate, etched in gold lettering. A long silence followed. Even the distant hum of cars on the main road became crystal clear. Karen's expression shifted from frantic to stunned. And I could see it sinking in if this whole scheme had just unraveled. And then, breaking that tense silence, came the chime of a phone ringtone, generic and harmless in tone, but deafening in context. Everyone turned to look as Karen's phone lit up in her hand. The caller ID glowed like a flare in the darkness. Boss A, Pacific Development Corporation. Every person standing there froze as if time had momentarily stopped. Karen's eyes widened in sheer panic. She grabbed the phone like it might explode and tried to silence it before anyone could process what they'd just seen. But the damage was already done. Sheriff Rodriguez had clearly seen the name. Deputy Martinez, who'd been quietly observing, immediately began scribbling in his notebook with fresh urgency, and Mrs. Chen had that unmistakable Ahalka one I'd seen her wear only once before, when she single-handedly shut down a shady petition at last year's town meeting. Things were clicking into place now: the key, the surveillance, the documents, the phone call. Karen wasn't just some overzealous neighbor, there was something bigger at play, and I had the sickening feeling that this all traced back to my land. "Are you going to answer that call, Mrs. Whitfield?" Rodriguez asked, calm but firm, with that tone law enforcement uses when they're giving you a last chance to come clean. Karen clutched the phone to her chest like it was some fragile secret. Her head shook rapidly as she stammered, "It's a broken bar, it's spam, just one of those scam numbers. You know how it is. They call using fake company name as a broken bar, trying to trick people like USA Broken Bar." Her voice was climbing in pitch and speed, words colliding as she tried to outrun the truth. But the phone had already stopped ringing, and the silence it left behind was deafening. No one looked convinced. And in that moment, every person in that barn was wondering the same thing. What was the president of the Homeowners Association doing taking calls from a real estate development firm with a known reputation for land acquisitions? Her whole excuse about safety violations and anonymous tips was crumbling fast. Just when it seemed things couldn't get any more surreal, the sound of heavy boots crunching over gravel announced a new arrival. We all turned to see Jake Morrison approaching, my electrician and longtime friend. He was tall, solidly built, and had a no-nonsense attitude that came from years of working in the trades. "Hey Mason," he called out, "sorry I'm late. I wanted to double-check the motion sensors after that storm on Monday." Then he stopped, took in the police cars, the cluster of people, the broken padlock, Karen's ashen face, and the visible tension hanging in the air like thick smoke. His brows lifted slightly as he scanned the scene. "You at Broken Bar, did I miss something here?" he asked, cautiously, because this looks a lot more serious than a routine system check. He was trying to be tactful, the way only someone raised in a small town full of gossip and long memories could manage. And it was exactly the kind of witness I was grateful to have arrived just then. "Mr. Morrison," Sheriff Rodriguez said, turning toward him, "your timing might be Broken Bar." "Perfect timing," Sheriff Rodriguez said, clearly recognizing an opportunity to bring in someone with first-hand insight into the unfolding situation. "We're trying to make sense of some unusual activity involving Mr. Brooks's property. Since you've been handling his security system, you might be able to help us fill in some blanks." Jake gave a slow, measured nod and pulled out his tablet, swiping through files with the calm thoroughness of a professional who always kept detailed logs for liability and insurance reasons. "Well," he began, "when I set up Mason's security system last Tuesday, I motion detectors, cameras, remote logging. I also did some installations around the neighborhood this past month. All of it was at the request of Mrs. Whitfield." His eyes flicked over to Karen, now visibly unraveling, and his tone grew more cautious. "She said it was part of an HOA-approved initiative via something about upgrading surveillance for neighborhood watch." She asked specifically for a discrete monitoring tools. The way he said those last words made it clear he was beginning to question what kind of monitoring had really been going on. Before anyone could respond, Karen's phone rang again. This time, the name flashing on the screen brought an entirely new chill to the air. "David A. office." I instantly recognized it. Her husband, attorney David Whitfield, was calling from his law firm, probably trying to figure out why his wife hadn't returned what should have been a routine call. Karen stared at the screen like it had turned into a bomb timer. You could see her calculating whether answering would help or blow everything up even faster. "I suggest you take that call, Mrs. Whitfield," Sheriff Rodriguez said firmly, his tone leaving little room for argument. There was a subtle edge there, a growing curiosity about how she'd spin this disaster to the one person who might have once been firmly on her side. The ringtone kept chiming, steady and insistent. With each ping, Karen seemed to shrink, her composure peeling away layer by layer. Finally, she pressed accept and brought the phone to her ear, voice barely steady. "Hello, David," she said. The rest of the conversation was low and hurried, the kind of hushed tone people use when they're trying not to let an audience hear just how badly things are falling apart. We couldn't hear David's end, but Karen's responses told the story loud and clear. "Yes, a broken bar. I'm still at Mason's place. A broken bar. No, things are not fine." "David, what key? What are you talking about?" Each sentence made her sound smaller, more cornered. By the time she ended the call, she looked like someone who'd just realized her parachute had failed to open. "He's on his way," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. For the first time since this surreal chain of events began, I had the strong impression that David Whitfield wasn't coming to save her. If anything, he might be arriving to tie up loose ends. 15 minutes later, a sleek black BMW rolled into my driveway, its polished exterior gleaming under the afternoon sun. The man who stepped out was unmistakably David Whitfield, tall, immaculately dressed, his salt and pepper hair matching his expensive tailored suit. But there was something different about him today. He didn't move like a confident attorney. He walked with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who'd been expecting this moment for a while and dreading it. When his eyes met Karen's across the barnyard, the look he gave her wasn't confusion or concern. It was something far more painful, deep, exhausted disappointment. "Karen," he said. Just that, one word, but it landed heavier than any outburst could have. "You told me you were done with these a broken bar after what happened with the Hendersons." That sentence alone shifted the entire mood. Even the birds had gone silent. Karen's face cracked. Whatever she'd been hoping her husband would say, that clearly wasn't it. Sheriff Rodriguez took a respectful step forward, professionalism written all over him. This wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore. It had morphed into a complex legal matter. "Mr. Whitfield," the sheriff said, "I'm going to need to ask you a few questions about your wife's activities, particularly any connection she might have with Pacific Development Corporation." He held up the crumpled document that had fallen from Karen's coat earlier, now joined by more paperwork the officers had apparently discovered while quietly checking the contents of her purse. David's shoulders slumped slightly as he glanced over the papers. He didn't look shocked. He looked resigned. "Sheriff, I want it on the record I wasn't aware of any specific illegal actions taken by my wife," he said carefully, his words measured like a man who understood exactly how they might be used later. "But I have had growing concerns about her fixation on certain properties around the neighborhood for the past few months." He didn't look at Karen once while he spoke. The way his voice tightened, the way his gaze stayed fixed on the ground, it all pointed to a man who wasn't seeing this for the first time, but rather confirming what he'd already feared. "What do you mean by fixation, Mr. Whitfield?" Deputy Martinez asked, notebook ready, his pen poised midair. David looked up briefly, pain etched across his face like someone mourning the ghost of a relationship. "Karen has been obsessed with the idea that some homes in the area are obstacles to what she calls a community revitalization efforts. She spent hours researching deeds, ownership records, zoning law policy, anything she could use to create leverage." He took a breath, like the words themselves were difficult to release. "She's been outlining plans she refers to as acquisition strategies. I found documentation in her home office a few weeks ago, enough to suggest there was direct communication with developers. She told me it was just research," David said quietly, "for future HOA planning discussions." She made it sound innocent, but the way his voice tapered off at the end made it obvious that he'd never truly believed her. He had simply chosen denial over the grim alternative, that his wife was capable of something far worse. Karen finally spoke, but the sharp confidence she once wielded was gone. What came out was pleading, a frantic, panicked, almost childlike. "David, you don't understand the pressure we're under," she said, her voice rising as she gestured with nervous, erratic energy. Property values are flatlining in this neighborhood. People like Mason are clinging to outdated homes and refusing to get with the times. They're standing in the way of progress." Her words came fast, almost breathless. "I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this for the neighborhood and for everyone in Willowbrook Heights." Someone had to take charge. The intensity in her voice was real. But it wasn't righteousness, it was desperation masquerading as purpose. She had convinced herself that what she was doing was noble, even as it became increasingly clear she was driven by ambition and self-interest. Listening to her justify harassment and manipulation as some kind of public service was deeply unsettling. Then Sheriff Rodriguez stepped forward, his face unreadable, and held out his phone to David. "These were recovered from your wife's device earlier today," he said evenly. "They include messages exchanged with Pacific Development Corporation. And more than that." David took the phone, brows furrowing as he began to scroll. The color drained from his face. "She didn't just reach out to developers," the sheriff continued. "She orchestrated fake complaints against at least 4 homeowners including Mr. Brooks and systematically tracked residents' daily routines. The goal was to pressure people into selling, using what we believe were coordinated intimidation tactics." The words landed like bricks. David looked up, and all warmth had vanished from his expression. Where there had once been conflict, now there was only cold certainty, the kind a lawyer might reserve for a client who had just confessed to an unwinnable case. "What you've done," he said, staring directly at Karen, "goes far beyond bad judgment. This is organized coercion. It's criminal conspiracy." His voice held no anger, just a finality that made it clear something permanent had broken between them. "I can't defend this." "I won't. You're on your own now." Karen's face crumpled as if the weight of her husband's words had physically struck her. There was something tragic in her collapse, but it was a tragedy of her own design, one built from calculated decisions and selfish intentions. It was hard to feel sympathy for someone who had been willing to ruin lives to boost her property portfolio. Then came the message that changed everything. Sheriff Rodriguez showed David a text buried deep in Karen's history. It read, "Phase 2, ready. If Brooks resists, execute the Chen plan. Henderson president confirms pressure tactics effective." The language was chilling, cold, tactical, and horrifying in its implications. This wasn't random harassment, it was a planned campaign. "And Mrs. Chen and I were never incidental targets. We had been selected deliberately." Deputy Martinez was already on his radio, requesting FBI involvement, while Sheriff Rodriguez kept scrolling through what now appeared to be a vast network of correspondencia, emails, text threads, property evaluations, even behavior profiles of neighborhood residents. It was staggering in scope. The peaceful illusion of Willowbrook Heights was shattered. Mrs. Chen had been quiet throughout the unfolding disaster, but now she spoke, her voice calm and focused. "Officers," she said, stepping forward, "I believe I have some additional information that may be relevant." She pulled out a slim leather-bound notebook from her purse and opened it to a section filled with meticulous handwriting. Dates, times, observations, evidence collected with the diligence of a seasoned legal mind. "I've been documenting a number of concerning incidents over the past several months," she said. "One of them was the death of my dog, Buster, 3 weeks ago. The vet's findings suggested antifreeze poisoning. I don't use any such product." The matter-of-fact way she delivered the information made it even more chilling, and the look on Karen's face, ashen and panicky, told us all we needed to know. She hadn't realized anyone had been watching her. Then Jake Morrison, who had been quietly reviewing something on his tablet, looked up. "Sheriff," he said, his voice tight with realization, "I think I've found something." He flipped the tablet toward Rodriguez. "When Karen hired me to install those cameras around the neighborhood, she said it was for emergency coordination and public safety. She specifically asked for remote monitoring access, said the HOA needed it to manage community response times." He scrolled through logs, his brow furrowing deeper. "But these access records show something else. Someone has been logging and daily tracking residents' routines, logging when people leave, when deliveries arrive, even which lights come on at what time." He looked up, grim. This wasn't about safety, this was surveillance. Tracking household schedules, even capturing private conversations in outdoor areas. Jake continued. I built in monitoring software as a precaution, and from what I'm seeing, Mrs. Whitfield has been surveilling at least a dozen homes consistently over the last 4 months. The weight of his words hit hard. Sheriff Rodriguez's expression shifted as he rapidly began considering the implications of this wasn't just unethical, it could escalate into major federal charges involving privacy violations and organized criminal activity. But before anyone could respond, the sheriff's radio came alive with a crackle. A voice broke through, a clear, authoritative, and unmistakably serious. This is Special Agent Sarah Chen. The transmission began. Sheriff Rodriguez, I believe you have someone in custody related to our investigation. Agent Chen, Mrs. Chen's niece, had been working behind the scenes as part of a sweeping federal probe into real estate corruption. Her voice was calm but urgent as she explained, we've been tracking Pacific Development Corporation for a year and a half. It's a coordinated, multi-state operation involving real estate fraud and money laundering. We've identified similar tactics in 5 other states. As local contacts identify valuable properties, then they use threats, harassment, and fabricated complaints to drive owners out and secure the land at below-market prices. She paused briefly. If you've got someone connected to them, we need to coordinate immediately. This could be the break we've been hoping for. Silence followed. But the gravity of what Agent Chen had just revealed lingered like a thunderclap. Karen was visibly unraveling. She was pacing back and forth near the barn's entryway, her movements jittery, eyes darting around like a cornered animal searching for a way out. When she finally spoke, her voice was laced with panic and defiance. You don't get it? She snapped. You're standing in the way of progress. Pacific Development is bringing in millions in investment, a real opportunity that could lift this entire area out of irrelevance. Her words poured out faster and faster, the polished mask she had worn all this time now fully shattered. Beneath it was raw greed, cloaked in self-righteous justification. Mason and people like him are clinging to the past, refusing to adapt. She spat. They're blocking growth and wasting land that could be used for something bigger, something better. I'm trying to make this place thrive. There was a desperate fervor in her tone as she truly believed that what she was doing was visionary. But all I saw was someone who had lost the ability to distinguish ambition from exploitation. Then came the unmistakable sound of black SUVs rumbling up the drive. The FBI had arrived. And in that surreal moment, standing in front of my grandfather's barn, I realized my peaceful day of restoring old furniture had turned into ground zero for a federal case. This wasn't just about a property dispute, it was about an entire operation being exposed, a one that had likely gone undetected for years, until it ran up against the wrong town and the wrong people. What haunted me more than anything was the realization that this might not be the end but merely the start of a much larger story. I used to think that defending my farm meant preserving acreage and a family name, but now I understood. I was defending a legacy of integrity, community, and the quiet truths our grandparents left behind. Jason Miller, screenwriter, Harper Stories, Chicago. At exactly 11:47 p.m., hours after the FBI finished their interviews and the neighborhood had seemingly returned to normal, Jake's motion sensor system sent out an alert. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the chaos, when my phone buzzed. The security app showed movement by the barn, but this wasn't a casual passerby, this was purposeful, calculated movement. The night vision feed from the cameras Jake had installed confirmed it. 3 figures, creeping along the rear fence line. Their body language was too precise, too coordinated. This was no prank. Karen's silhouette stood out even in the grainy footage. She was unmistakable as she led 2 larger individuals toward the barn and toward the antique chair that had sparked the day's confrontation. My pulse quickened. After everything of the arrest, the evidence, the federal charges, Karen was still at it, still chasing her plan, even if it meant risking everything in a final, reckless act to erase whatever she thought might incriminate her. I snatched up my phone and called Jake. He answered almost immediately. Mason, I'm watching the footage right now. I've already looped in Sheriff Rodriguez, he said without skipping a beat. His voice was tensely steady, but charged with the kind of adrenaline that comes with watching a crime unfold in real time. She's not alone. The 2 men with her look serious. They're carrying what looks like power tools, probably going after that antique piece to destroy whatever they think is hidden in it. Thankfully, Jake had built a live broadcast function into the system, a private emergency channel that was already streaming. Everything they were doing was being captured and documented, second by second. "I've sent out an emergency alert to the neighborhood watch," Jake added. "Backups on the way. Don't engage until law enforcement arrives." His tone told me he was already grabbing gear and heading over, whether I wanted him to or not. Then I heard the whir of power tools starting up inside the barn. A surge of anger, deeper and sharper than anything I'd ever felt, surged through me. This wasn't just trespassing. This was a deliberate, personal invasion. The sight of my family's legacy being torn apart ignited something primal in me, a fierce instinct to protect what was mine. Every part of me wanted to storm out there and confront them. Consequences be damned. But I held back. Instead of giving in to rage, I forced myself to think clearly, to make sure these intruders didn't just get scared off if they got caught. The live stream from the barn was already gaining traction. Members of the neighborhood watch were chiming in, posting shocked comments as they recognized Karen and her accomplices. The anger in the thread was immediate and intense. Mrs. Chen, watching the footage from her own home, quickly posted that she was recording from multiple camera angles. She had already called her niece at the FBI, reporting that the suspects were actively destroying evidence tied to an ongoing federal investigation. Within minutes, neighbors were mobilizing. Several messaged that they were en route to provide backup and serve as witnesses. The response was swift and unified, a community no longer willing to be bullied. By the time I slipped outside, staying low and hugging the shadows, Karen and her two accomplices had forced open the antique chair. They were tearing through the contents with frantic urgency, the kind of energy that comes when you're out of time and desperate for control. What they found inside, however, changed everything. Karen's face twisted into something between triumph and panic as she held up a bundle of old documents. It was clear she had found something important, something she both desperately wanted and immediately regretted uncovering. Legal papers, likely tied to land rights or ownership. She fumbled to take photos with her phone, even as she began ripping the pages apart, caught between preserving what might save her and destroying what could condemn her, and the cameras captured it all. Every frantic motion, every shred of evidence, every criminal act broadcast in real time to a growing audience. Just as Karen reached for a lighter, attempting to burn what remained, Sheriff Rodriguez's patrol car came barreling up the drive. His spotlight lit the barn like a theater stage. "Karen Whitfield, you are under arrest for breaking and entering, destruction of property, and tampering with evidence in a federal investigation," he announced through his vehicle's PA, his voice firm and final. Karen's two hired men dropped their tools and tried to bolt, but they didn't get far. The neighborhood had shown up in force, familiar faces and strangers alike, forming a human wall of resistance. It felt almost cinematic, like a moment from a film where a town finally takes back control. But the real finale came when Karen, covered in ash from her failed arson, surrounded by police and neighbors, made one last pathetic attempt to redirect blame. "This is a setup," she shrieked, eyes wild. "Mason Brooks is laundering money through fake antique sales. I was trying to expose him before he destroyed the evidence." Her voice cracked as she pointed at me, desperation dripping from every word. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so deranged. Jake's voice cut through the live stream audio like a scalpel. "Calm, clear, cold. Everything Karen did tonight has been documented. She broke in, destroyed evidence, tried to set a fire, all while Mason remained inside, cooperating fully with law enforcement. No one was buying her story, not anymore, and the documents Karen had tried so hard to destroy turned out to be far more valuable than any of us had imagined. When Agent Chen later reviewed the surviving fragments, the full scope of Pacific Development Corporation's crimes became undeniable. Hidden within the antique chair sealed away for over 15 years was my grandparents' original will, detailed land surveys, and mineral rights documentation. But the most explosive piece was a collection of forged documents, evidence Pacific Development had been using for over a decade to fraudulently claim land throughout the county. The irony was bitter and perfect. Karen, so obsessed with manipulating the system to seize my property, had unearthed the very evidence that would end her criminal enterprise. Agent Chen later described the documents as the missing puzzle piece in a massive case, the proof they needed to show that Pacific Development had been operating a multi-state fraud ring, using fake paperwork, threats, and corrupt local officials to steal land from unsuspecting families. Karen's day of reckoning came 6 months later in federal court. The judge, clearly tired of her attempts to rebrand herself as a misunderstood community leader, didn't hold back. The charges laid out against her were staggering: 9 federal felonies, including conspiracy to commit mail fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, bribery of public officials, and more. She wasn't just a villain in our town's story, she was a symbol of how greed, when left unchecked, could rot the foundation of a community until enough people stood up and said, "No more." Karen faced an extensive list of charges: illegal surveillance, evidence destruction, breaking and entering, attempted arson, and racketeering as part of a larger criminal organization. Her sentencing drew a packed courtroom, filled with victims from across the region, a people finally given the opportunity to share how Pacific Development Corporation had nearly stolen their homes, drained their savings, and in some cases, shattered their mental health. Sitting at the defense table, Karen looked nothing like the confident, controlling woman I once knew. Gone was the smug expression and self-assured posture. In its place was a hollow stare, a defeated figure who had finally been forced to face the consequences of her actions. When the judge handed down her sentence, 8 years in federal prison, 5 years of supervised release, and full restitution to every verified victim, the collective exhale from the courtroom was almost palpable. From my seat in the back, I could feel the weight lifting. Pacific Development Corporation didn't survive the scandal. It was dismantled entirely. Every asset was seized and sold off to fund restitution payments. The company's top brass weren't spared either. The CEO received a 15-year prison term. The COO got 12, and a wide web of local officials who'd accepted bribes to facilitate the scheme were systematically ousted and prosecuted under federal law. Deputy Martinez, who had quietly been feeding false reports and stalling investigations on Karen's behalf, was sentenced to 3 years in prison and permanently stripped of his law enforcement credentials, a stark reminder that corruption has no safe harbor, even behind a badge. It took nearly 2 years to clean up the mess, but when it was done, the transformation in our community was undeniable. Property values recovered, local government became more transparent, more accountable, and the cloud of fear and mistrust that had hung over Willowbrook Heights for years finally began to clear. The restitution funds I received helped me reimagine my woodworking business into something far more meaningful. Mason's Heritage Woodworks became a non-profit that teaches traditional craftsmanship to at-risk youth and offers affordable restoration services to elderly residents and lower-income families. The same barn where this entire saga began is now a thriving workshop. Teenagers gather there to learn hands-on skills that foster discipline, pride, and self-worth. Every piece they build includes a brass plaque engraved with, "Built with pride in Willowbrook Heights." Mrs. Chen, now our newly elected HOA president-elect in a landslide, established a community protection fund that offers legal support to residents facing threats or intimidation from aggressive developers or exploitative businesses. Jake Morrison expanded his electrical company to include full-scale security consulting. He now travels across the region, helping other towns safeguard themselves from the kinds of coordinated harassment we endured. Even David Whitfield, Karen's ex-husband, chose the path of redemption. He shifted his legal practice to serve victims of real estate fraud, offering pro bono representation to those devastated by scams like the one Karen orchestrated. Before the trial, he finalized their divorce and went on to create a charitable foundation in Karen's name, one that provides counseling and financial aid to people harmed by white-collar crime. A fitting, if ironic, twist that her final legacy would be one of healing rather than harm. 6 months after Karen's sentencing, Willowbrook Heights hosted its first ever Community Resilience Festival. We weren't just celebrating the defeat of a criminal network, we were honoring the courage, unity, and strength we discovered in ourselves when we had no choice but to stand together. I remember watching children try their hand at woodworking, neighbors sharing laughs and stories, and families enjoying a day that felt like a true fresh start. It struck me that Anna Karen, without meaning to, had given us something lasting, the realization that our unity was stronger than any threat, and that no bully, no matter how connected or cunning, could defeat a community that refused to back down. Have you ever felt powerless against a neighbor who acts like they own the street, or worried about holding on to something your family worked hard to leave behind? You're not alone. At HOA Stories, we believe that everyday people have the strength to rise up, stand firm, and win, not with violence, but with truth, strategy, and community support. Mason's story is living proof that justice can prevail, even against deeply entrenched corruption. If stories like this give you hope, if they remind you that decency can win the day, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to HOA Stories, where the good guys still win. Thanks for spending your time with us, and if this episode made you feel just a little better about that mysteriously dented $50 mailbox, consider sticking around. We've got more stories where justice gets the dramatic payoff it deserves.